Will, welcome to Talk Python to me.
Hello. Yeah, excited to be here, Michael. I've been listening to Talk Python like for I can't even remember how long, but I'm pretty sure it was before I had a first Python job. So yeah, a long, long time.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, now you're helping create it. It's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. No, yeah,
Yeah,
super excited to be on Chat Colo.
yeah. We're going to talk about Colo, your Visual Studio Code, Django. I don't even know what to call it. It's pretty advanced, pretty in depth. Extension seems to be not quite enough. So, what a neat project. People are going to really dig that. People who Django, and we'll see what the future plans are if, if we could talk you into other ones. But for now, Django
100%.
plus
Yeah.
Django plus VS Code is going to be super interesting. Before we get to that, of course, you must know the drill. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. So, my name is Will. I've been using Django since, well, I guess I've been using Python since about 2013, I want to say. So a little over 10 years. And yeah, just kind of like fell in love with it. Wanted to make websites, started using Django, and yeah, I guess never really looked back. Um, that was in school back then, but kind of always had a love for like tinkering and building side projects. I actually did a management degree in university,
Hmm.
but I really loved hanging out with all the computer science kids, all the computer science students, and I think a part of me really wanted to impress them. So I was always building side projects, and one of them was actually a Slack app called SimplePoll. And yeah, we were trying to organize something in Slack and really felt like the need for polls. So built this little side project just like during university, and then it became really really popular. And a few years later, it became my full time job. So for the
No
past
kidding. That's awesome.
yeah 4 years, I've been running Simple Polls, a Slack app, building out the team up to like 7 8 of us. And yeah, had a great time doing that. In the middle, actually worked at GitHub for 2 years, working on Ruby and Rails, and that was super fun. Like a great company, great people, huge code base. Learned a lot there. That was really fun. But yeah, left after about 2 years to work full time on Simple Poll. So Simple Poll had been running as a side project, kind of in the background. And actually, it's interesting. Like I think kind of the order of events thinking back, Microsoft was acquired GitHub while I was there. And then suddenly all of my colleagues started talking about buying boats and leaving the company. And I thought, I don't quite have boat money, but how can I what's an ace I might have up my sleeve?
Yeah.
And it was Simple Poll, which had got like tons of users, but I never monetized it. So I set out to monetize it, and then a year later, it was actually bringing in more revenue than my salary at GitHub. So I decided to quit. So that's kind of the Simple Poll backstory. So Simple Poll is a Django app, reasonably sized now, a bunch of people working on it. And then yeah, at some point in the journey of building Simple Poll, um, I kind of started playing around with Colo. So Colo also kind of just like Simple Poll started as a side project, but now not to make polls in Slack, but instead to improve my own developer experience building Simple Poll. So kind of built it as my own tool for making Django. Yeah, working with Django more fun, give me more insight, give me access to some of the data that I felt was so close, but that I had to just like manually get in there and print out. So the reason Colo started out as supporting just Django and VS Code is because that's what I was using, and it was an internal side project.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, and now actually handed over Simple Poll to a new CEO. I'm no longer involved day to day, and I'm working full time on Colo.
Man, congratulations on like multiple levels. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to talk to you a bit about Simple Poll for just a minute. But before
Yeah.
then, you pointed out like, look, I made this side project, and how many hours are you spending on it? A week, maybe?
Oh, it was interesting. So honestly, like, so this was like right at the beginning, like when it was first started. Yeah, it's a good time. It's a good question. I always joke that the best thing about my management degree was that I had a lot of free time to like build side projects. Honestly, I think it could have been like 20, 30, 40 hours a week.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. That was that. Yeah, it could have. I think it definitely varied week to week.
And then later on,
And then and then while I was working, when I had a full-time job as a software engineer, that was a lot tougher. It was like nights and weekends. Rarely
yeah,
had energy during the week to work on it. And then honestly, like since it was a real project with real users, I ended up spending a lot of the weekend doing like
it's
support.
like support stuff. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
support
Yeah,
and like then you charge, and then now you have finance stuff and like legal stuff to do. So that wasn't super fun.
it
Like not
really slows down the features and the creation of stuff,
exactly.
doesn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say I probably spend fully 50% of my full-time job doing email support,
Wow. Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Just like there's
Yeah.
tons of people taking courses and listening to podcasts, and they'll have
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
questions and thoughts, and it's awesome, but it also is really tricky. So the reason I ask is I always find it fascinating. You'll see like news articles. I don't know. They're always clickbaity or whatever. This person makes 3 times their job working 10 hours a week on this other thing. Like, if you make
Right.
3 times what you make for your job, what are you doing at your job? You know what I mean? Right? And
Yeah.
just the ability to say you could make that step where you go from kind of tired at nights, extra time, and squeezing in on the
Yeah.
weekends to full time, full energy.
Yeah.
If it's already doing well, on like a very thin life support, like then give it full energy, full time and energy. It's just, of course, it's
Yeah,
going to do better,
it's so
right?
interesting. I actually have a lot of thoughts about this. Maybe I should write something about this at some point. But I actually think running like a bootstrap side project kind of business as you have a job can be really good because it
Mm,
really forces you to prioritize and build the most important things.
yeah, it's kind of
I
like
think.
having kids.
Oh, nice. Yeah, yeah. I need to try that someday.
Oh, you'll be real tired. I tell you, you'll love to prioritize your time.
That's awesome. No, yeah, I think it really forces you to prioritize. So I actually sometimes recommend when folks ask me like for advice, like should I quit my job to go all in or not? Um, I actually sometimes think there's a lot of nice stability
Yeah.
and that comes from having a job. Plus, it's actually really nice to have coworkers. It's nice to have structure. Like you
Mm,
actually need to take all of that, well, work in a way on yourself. Like it's, if you have to make your own structure, like if you're building your own thing, and that can actually be a bit tricky. Like I really struggled with that at the beginning.
mhm.
So I think there's something to be said for, uh, for working on, um, for spending like limited time on something basically, and prioritizing
Yeah,
just the
that's
most
an
important
interesting
things.
angle, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and then also I think so for me it was interesting like. Uh, in terms of like how much like life support energy you put in versus like full-time energy, I it was growing decently like while I was still at GitHub, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna go in on this full time, and if I go from like 10 hours a week or less to like 40 hours a week, that would probably 4x the growth rate as well. That's how it works, right? And
Yeah, of
like it
course.
totally didn't work. Like it
No.
totally didn't work. In fact, like I think the month after I left, I had like my first down month where like the revenue decreased. And I was
Mhm.
like, wait a minute, what's going on here? How that doesn't make any sense. That's not fair. So I think that also points at like you can definitely spend more hours on something and it can be like the wrong things or not doubling down on something that's really working. So but overall obviously at some point like just being able to like test out more ideas is like really valuable. And for that, like I mean if you only have time to do support on your project that's really working well, and your full-time job is the rest of the how you spend your week, then feels like you should give yourself some time to build features and maybe quit the job.
Yeah. Well, it's also an interesting point about the structure, because
Mm,
not everyone is gonna get up at 8 o'clock, sit at their desk, and they're gonna be like, I kind of can just do whatever, and you know, it's its own discipline, its own learned skill.
100%. Yeah. Yep. I remember like one of the first weeks after I was full time on Simple Poll, I woke up in the morning and said, well, the money's coming in. I don't need to work. I don't have a boss. And I just sit in bed and watch YouTube videos all day. And then I just felt miserable at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I was like, this is supposed to feel great. Why all this freedom I've wanted and dreamt about for so long? Why does it not feel great?
Yeah, it also feels like risk and more different kinds of responsibility. All right,
Yeah.
so Simple Poll. The reason I said it'd be worth talking about a little bit is, Slack's a popular platform, and this is based on Django, right?
Yeah. So Simple Poll
Tell people,
is a full
tell
on
people
Django
about
app.
it. Yeah.
And it's funny. Sometimes people joke that I don't know if you've gone through the official Django tutorial, but in there you actually make a polls app in the browser. So sometimes people joke, "Wait, did you just turn this into like a Slack app and then
You
made a bunch of
productize the
money?"
getting started tutorial. Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, like it turned out that like polls and then yeah, getting your team more connected in Slack and more engaged are like things people really care about. So yeah, it came to the Slack. Simple Poll joined the Slack platform like at the perfect time, and has just been growing super well since then.
Hmm. Tell people a little bit about what it takes technically to make a Slack app. I mean,
Yeah,
Slack is not built in Python as far as I know, and it's probably JavaScript and Electron mostly the people interact with, right? So what is the deal
true.
here?
Yeah, it's actually super interesting. So the way you build like a Slack app, it's actually all backend based. So when a user interacts in Slack, Slack sends your app, your backend, like a JSON payload saying like this user clicked this button, and then you can just send a JSON payload back
Mm,
saying all right, now show this message, now show this modal. And they have their own JSON based BlockKit framework where you can render different types of content. So you don't actually have to think about JavaScript or React or any of their stack at all. It's basically all sending JSON payloads around and calling various parts of the Slack API. So you can build a Slack app in your favorite language, any kind of exotic language if you wanted to. But yeah, I love Python, so I decided to build it in Python and Django. So yeah, actually building Slack apps is a really like pleasant experience.
mhm. Interesting.
Yeah.
What's the deployment backend story look like? Is it a PaaS sort of thing, serverless,
Yeah,
VMs?
so
What do you
at the
do?
time it was Heroku.
Mm,
Simple was running on Heroku, and then I think a few years ago we migrated it to AWS.
mhm.
So now it's running on AWS and ECS.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
So, Docker for the win. Right on.
Yeah.
Um,
How does it work in
yeah.
Talk Python? I'm curious. Where are you deployed?
It's all DigitalOcean, and then I have one big, like, 8 CPU server running, I think, 16 different Django apps, not Django,
Oh,
sorry,
no way.
Docker apps. No, sorry, Docker apps that
Okay.
are all all doing, like, some of them share a database that's in Docker, and some of them do, sort of have their own self-contained pair of, like, web app and database and so on. But
Yeah.
it's all Docker on one big server, which it's fairly
Nice.
new for me, and it's glorious. It's glorious.
That's awesome. Very, very
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. All right. So again, congrats on this. Very, very neat. Let's talk Colo. So
Let's do it.
I first came across this. I've come across it independently twice. Once, um, when the Django chat guys recommended that I talk to you because they're like, Will's doing cool stuff. You should definitely talk to him. This Django thing for VS Code is super cool. But also, I can't remember. There's somebody on your team whose social media profile I came across, and I saw this. I'm like, oh, this is pretty neat. I think we even covered it on the Python Bytes podcast.
Oh,
Um,
no way.
let's see. Yeah, sure. In January we did. So
Awesome.
yeah. So that's that we talked about a little bit, but this just looks like such a neat thing. And I encourage people who may be interested in this to visit colo.app because it's a super visual sort of experience of understanding your code, right? Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean 100%. Yeah, it's a funny thought. I hadn't really thought yet that yeah, a podcast is going to be a hard way to describe the visual beauty and magic that Colo can bring to your code. But yeah, 100%. Yeah, so Colo like very much started as like the idea of hey, like I should be able to see like how my code actually flows. I think like all of us as we build software, as we write our Python code, we have this kind of like mental model of how all the different functions like fit together,
Mhm.
how like a bit of data ends up from like the beginning like to the end. Like it passes through maybe a bunch of functions, it passes through a bunch of like classes, a bunch of loops. All the state gets like modified, and we have this kind of like mental picture of all of that in our head. And the kind of very beginning of Colo, the question I asked myself was like, is there a way we can just like visualize that? Is there a way we can just actually print that out onto a screen? So if you go to Colo.app, it kind of looks like this funny sun chart with like lots of like a kind of a sunny tree chart with lots of
Yeah.
nodes going from the center and like going off into the distance, which I think is like, yeah, similar to like what folks kind of might already have in their head about like um how the code flows. Maybe another way to describe it is, imagine like you enable a debugger at the beginning of every function and at the end of every function in your code, and you print out like what was the function name, what were the input arguments, what was the return value, and then you arrange all of that in a graph that then shows which
Yeah.
function called which other function.
It almost looks like what you get out of profilers.
Right.
When you say like, okay, this function took 20%, but if you
Yep.
expand it out, I'll say, well, it really spent 5% there, 10% there, and then a bunch
Yep.
of it. And you can kind of traverse that. But
100%. Yep.
you're not, I'm guessing you're not really interested in how long it took, although maybe you can probably get that out of it. It's
Yeah.
the important is more what what is the dependency, what are the variables being passed, and like understanding individual behavior, right? Or
Right.
maybe,
Exactly.
yeah, what do you
So
think?
yeah, 100%. I think like it's interesting because Colo actually uses under the hood like a bunch of the Python profiling APIs. And I think people often think of Colo as a profiler. We do actually have um, a like traditional profiling based chart which puts the timing at the center. But you're absolutely right that like the focus of our like main chart, the one that we're both looking at, that has like this idea of the function overview and like which function calls which. The idea there is like absolutely the hierarchy, and seeing like giving yourself essentially that, yeah, giving yourself that same mental model that someone who's worked on a code base for 3 months has in their
Mhm.
head immediately, like yourself, by just looking at it. So you can kind of usually in the way these charts turn out, you can notice that there's like points of interest. Like there's one function that has a lot of children, so that clearly is coordinating like a bunch of the work. Or you can see kind of similarities in the structure of the of some of the subtrees, so you know, oh, okay, maybe that's like a loop and it's the same thing happening a couple times. So you can essentially, I get this overview, and then it's fully interactive, and you can dive in to like what exactly is happening.
Yeah. Is it interact so I can, like, click on these pieces and it'll pull them up?
Yeah, so we actually and this is it'll be live by the time this podcast goes live. We actually have a playground in the browser. This is also super fun. We can talk about this. Well, let me drop you a link real quick. This will be at play.colo.app. So with this, yeah, this is super fun because this is fully Python just running in the browser using Pyodide and like
Oh,
WebAssembly.
nice. Okay.
Um, but yeah, so this is the fully visual version, where you can, yeah, it defaults to loading like a simple Fibonacci algorithm,
Yeah.
and you can see like what the Cola visualization of Fibonacci looks like, and you can
Mhm.
actually edit the code and see how it changes with your edits and all of that. We have a couple other examples.
Wow. The pandas one and the whack-a-mole one are pretty intense. They're pretty wild pictures. They look like, sort of Japanese fans or whatever, the
Yeah, exactly. We
circular
actually
ones.
we once had a competition at a conference to see who could make like the most fun looking algorithm, and visualize it with Colo. But yeah, like yeah, it's fun. Like visualizing code is really great.
Yeah, that's awesome. So this is super cool. It's just all from scratch. It's besides Pyodide here, not like, VS Code in the
Yeah, I
browser or
mean,
anything like that?
I think it's using Monaco in this case, or CodeMirror, but otherwise this
Yeah.
is all yeah, this is Pyodide and a little bit of React to like pull kind of the data together.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, we're really
Wow.
it's otherwise homemade. And
Right.
yeah, this is kind of like the kind of what Colo has been for like the past like 2 years or so, has been this kind of side project for Simple Poll to help like just visualize and understand code better. The Simple Poll code base, to be honest, has grown so large that like there's parts of it that I wrote like 5 years ago that I don't understand anymore. And it's like annoying to get back to that and having to spend like a day to refamiliarize myself with everything. It's a
Yeah.
lot nicer to just like to actually kind of explain like end to end how it works. You install like in a Django project, you install Colo as a middleware, and
Yeah.
then as you just browse and use your Django app and make requests, traces get saved. So Colo records these traces. They actually get saved in a local SQLite database. And then you can view the traces, which includes the visualization, but also like lots of other data. Like you can actually see in the version you have there, like we show every single function
Yeah.
call, like the inputs and outputs for each function call. So the main idea of Colo is to like really show you everything that happened in your code. So in a Django app, that would be like the request, the response, like all the headers, every single function call, input and output, outbound requests, SQL queries as well. So the goal is to show you everything. And then you can view these stored traces either through VS Code or and this is also will be live by the time this episode goes live, through like a web middleware version, which is a bit similar to Django debug toolbar. Not sure if you've played around much with Django
Yeah.
debug toolbar.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Those things were actually pretty impressive. Right. I played out with that one and the pyramid one, and
Yeah.
you can see more than I think you would reasonably expect from just a little thing on the side of your web app.
Yeah, exactly. It's like really and that's very much our goal too, like very kind of deep deep insight. And but in our minds, this is almost like a bit like old news. Like we've been using this for like a few years basically.
Mhm.
And then at some point like last year, we started playing around with this idea of like, okay, so we have this trace that has information about like pretty much everything that happened in like a request. Is there any way we could use that to solve this like reasonably large pain point for us, which is like writing tests? I'm actually curious.
Right.
Do you enjoy writing tests?
No. I used to actually I'll tell you what, I used to actually. I
Okay.
used to really enjoy writing tests, and I used to enjoy thinking a lot about it, and then as the projects would get bigger, I'm like, this is these tests don't really cover what I need them to cover anymore, and they're kind of
Mm,
dragging it down. And then, the thing that really kind of knocked it out for me is I'd have like teammates, and they wouldn't care about the tests at all. So they would
right.
break the tests or just write a bunch of code without tests. And I felt kind of like a parent cleaning up after kids. You're like,
Mm,
why is it so? What can we just pick up? Like, why are there dishes here?
yeah,
Just going around. I'm like, this is not what I want to do. Like, I want to just write software, and like,
yeah.
I understand the value of tests, of course, but
100%. Yeah.
at the same time, I feel like maybe higher order integration tests often,
Yeah.
for me at least, serve more value, because it's like I could write 20 little unit tests, or I could write
Right.
2 integration tests,
I'm actually
and it's
completely
probably
with
gonna
you
work.
on that.
Okay,
Yeah.
right
I
on.
think the bang for the buck of integration tests are like great. Like really, really useful. Like, yeah, I think you can almost think of tests as having like two purposes. One being like, well, actually, I think this would be too simple an explanation. Let me not make grand claims about all the uses of tests. I think the most that the use of it that most people are after is this idea of like, what I've built isn't going to break by accident.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you want confidence that any future change you make doesn't impact a bunch of unrelated stuff that it's not supposed to impact. I think that's what most people are after with tests, and I think for that specific desired result, like integration tests are the way to go. And there's some cool writing about this from there's a I wrote a little blog post about Colo's test generation abilities, and in there I linked to a post from Kent C. Dodds from the JavaScript community, who has a great post about, I think it's called write tests, not too many, mostly integration, kind of after this
Nice.
idea of like
Yeah.
eat not too much, mostly vegetables. I think that's the
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of that. And actually, it's interesting. I've speaking to a bunch of folks over the past like year about tests. I think a lot of engineers think about writing tests as vegetables, and obviously some people love vegetables, and some of us love writing tests. But it seems like for a lot of folks, it's kind of like a obviously necessary part of creating great software, but it's maybe not like the most fun part of our job.
Right.
And
Or you pick up, some project, you're a consultant, or you're
right,
taking over some open source project, and you're like, this has no tests.
right, yeah, yeah,
It's
and
kind of like running a linter, and it says there's 1,000 errors. You're like, well, we're not going to do that.
yeah,
We're just not going to run the linter against it because it's too messed up at this
yeah.
point, right?
It's interesting you mentioned the picking up like a project with no tests, because I think within the next 3 months, we're not quite there yet, but I think in the next 3 months with Colo's test generation abilities, we'll have a thing where, all we need is a Python code base to get started, and then we can bring that to like a really respectable level of code coverage just by using Colo.
Okay,
So-
how?
Cool. Let's talk about the how. So yeah, I was kind of talking about this a second ago. Oh, sorry, there's just a helicopter flying by. Not sure
I
if you
don't
can
hear it.
hear
It's
that.
fine. You're good. You got a good mic.
Nice. Yeah, so I was kind of describing a second ago how like we kind of, Simple Poll has tons of integration tests. Simple Poll actually is about 80,000 lines of application code, not including migrations and like config files. And then it's about 100,000 lines of tests. And most of that is integration tests. So Simple, very well tested. Lots of really mostly integration tests, but it is always a bit of a chore to like write them. So we started thinking about like, this like Colo tracing we're doing, can that help us with making tests somehow? And then we started experimenting with it, and like to our surprise, it's actually I'm still sometimes surprised that it actually works. But basically, the idea is that if you have a trace that has that captures everything in the request, you can kind of invert it to build a integration test. So let me give an example of what that means. The biggest challenge we found with creating integration tests is actually the test data setup. So getting your application into the right shape before you can send a request to it or before you can call a certain function, that's like kind of the hardest part. Writing the asserts is almost like easy or even like fun, but like
right. There's the 3 A's of unit testing: range,
exactly.
assert, and act. Arrange, act, and assert.
Exactly. Yeah.
The first and the third one that you kind of have data on, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we're like, wait a second, we actually can like kind of extract this like the act, so like the arrange, setting up the data, the act, like actually making the HTTP request, and then the assert, like to ensure the status change or that the request go to 200 or something. We actually have the data for this, and it's reasonably straightforward. Like if you capture in just your like normal, like imagine you have a local to-do app and you browse like a to-do kind of demo, simple to-do app, and you browse to the homepage, and the homepage maybe lists the to-dos. And if you've got Colo enabled, then Colo will have captured the request, right? So like the request went to the homepage and it returned a 200. So that's already like two things we can now turn into code in our integration test. So first step being, I guess this is the act and the assert, in the sense that the assert is the 200, and then the act is firing off a request to the homepage. Now the tricky bit, and this is where it gets the most fun, is the arrange. So if we just put those two things into our test, to imaginary test, there wouldn't have been any to-dos there, right? So it's actually not an interesting test yet. But in your local version where the trace was recorded, you actually had maybe like 3 to-dos already in your database. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So on the homepage, like your to-do app might make a SQL query to like select all the to-dos or all the to-dos for the currently logged in user. So, and then Colo would store that SQL query, would store that select, and would also store actually what data the database returned. This is actually something where Colo goes beyond a lot of the existing kind of like debugging tooling that might exist.
Mhm.
Um, like actually showing exactly what data the database returned in a given SQL query. But imagine we get like a single to-do returned, right? We now know that to replicate this like trace in our test, we need to start by seeding that to-do into the database. So that's where like the trace inversion comes in. If like a request starts with a select of like the to-do table, then the first thing that needs to happen in the integration test is actually a like creating like an insert into the database for that
Right.
to do. And now when you fire off the request to the homepage, it actually goes through your real code path where like an actual to-do gets loaded and gets printed out onto the page. So that's like the most basic kind of example of like how can you turn like a locally captured trace of a request that like made a SQL query and returned 200 into like an integration test.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the things that makes me wanna write fewer unit tests
Mm,
or not write a unit test in a certain case is I can test given using mocking,
yep.
given my, let's say, SQL Alchemy or Beanie or whatever, Django RM
Yep.
model, it theoretically matches the database. I can do some stuff, set some values and check, and
Right.
that's all good. But in practice, if the schema in the database doesn't match the shape of my object,
Right.
it the system freaks out and crashes and says, "Well, that's not gonna work, right? There's no way." And so it
Yep.
doesn't matter how good I mock it out. It has to go kinda
Right.
end to end before I feel very good about it. Oh, yeah, okay, it's gonna really, really work, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly. I feel like
it's an
I've
interesting story, like you're saying
yeah,
to let's actually see if we can just create the data but,
yeah.
let it run all the way through, right?
And no, I'm totally with you. And I think that yeah, I've often seen like unit tests pass and say, I mean, there's like lots of memes about this, right? How like unit tests say everything is good, but the server is down. Like, how's that possible? Um, I think in Django world, it's reasonably common to write integration tests like this, as in like the actual database gets hit. You have this idea of like the Django test client, which sends like a real in air quotes HTTP request through the entire Django stack, as opposed to
Right.
doing the more unit test approach. So
Yeah, so it hits the
um,
routes, it
exactly,
hits, like, all of the that
hits
sort of
the
stuff all the
routes,
way, yeah.
hits the
And the
database,
template, yeah.
templates. Yep,
Mhm.
yep. And then at the end, you can assert based on like the content of the response, or you can check. Like, imagine if we go back to the to do example, if we're testing like the add to do endpoint or form submission, then you could make a database query at the end. And Colo actually does this as well because like again, we know like that you inserted a to do in your request, so we can actually make an assert. This is a different example of the trace inversion. If there's an insert in your request that you captured, then we know at the end of the integration test, we want to assert that this row now exists in the database. So you can assert at the very end to say, uh, does this row actually exist in the database now? So it's a
Right.
very nice kind of reasonably end to end, but still integration test. It's not like a brittle click around in the browser and kind of hope for the best kind of thing. It's like yeah, yeah. As we said at the beginning, I think like integration tests just get you great bang for your buck.
They really do. It's like the 80/20 rule of unit testing for sure.
Yep, yep. And I
So
think
is
some
this
of the
all
mm,
algorithmic or,
yep, great
uh,
question.
is it
Yeah.
is it LLMs? Like, how much VC funding are you looking for? Like, like, if you got the LLMs in there, like, they're coming out of the
That's
woodwork. No, I'm
amazing.
just kidding. No,
Yeah, yeah.
how do you how's this happen?
Yeah, so it's actually all algorithmic and rule based at the moment. So this idea of a select becomes like a like an insert, and then insert becomes like a select assert.
Yeah.
You can we were surprised how far we could get with just rules. And the benefit we have is that we kind of have this like full-sized simple Paul Django code base to play around with. And yeah, like generating integration tests in simple Paul just like fully works. There's a bunch of tweaks we like had to make to yeah, as soon as I guess you work in kind of like outside of a demo example, you want like time mocking and HTTP mocking, and you want to use your like factory boy factories, and like maybe you have a custom unit test like base class and all of this. But yeah, it actually works now. I gave a talk at DjangoCon Europe last year, and there was kind of like it's kind of like a bit of a wow moment in the audience where yeah, you just click generate test and it generates you like 100-line integration test, and the test actually passes. So that was like, yeah, people started clapping, which was a great feeling. I'm still a bit surprised that it works on it, but yeah, no LLM at all. I do think like LLMs could probably make these tests like even better. Or you know how I was saying a second ago, like in 3 months we could go take a code base from like 0 test coverage to maybe like 60%, 80%. I imagine if we made use of LLMs, that would help make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah. You could talk to it about like, well, these things aren't covered.
Right.
What can we do to cover them? And
Yep.
I don't know if you maybe could do fully automated, just push the button and let it generate it. But it could also be like a conversational, not a conversation, sort of a guided. Like, let's get the rest of the test. Like, okay, we're down to 80. We got 80%, but there's the last bit are a little tricky. Like, what ones are missing? All right. So, how do you think we could do this? Is that valid? No, you need to. That's not really the kind of data we're gonna pass. I don't know. It
Yeah,
seems something like that, right?
I really like that. I'd not thought
Yeah.
about like a conversation as a way to generate tests, but that makes so much sense.
Right.
I
And
think
kind
we
of
should
bringing
look at that.
the
Yeah.
developer along with them
Yeah,
where it's
exactly.
gotten
Yeah.
too hard or something,
Yeah. There's something cool about just clicking a button and see how much code coverage you could get to. But
Yeah.
yeah, chatting to it. I think also honestly, like so far, like our test generation logic is a bit of a black box. It
Mhm.
just kind of like works.
Yeah.
Until the point where like it doesn't. So we're actually kind of in the process of like shining a bit more of a light into like essentially the like internal data model that Colo keeps track of to know what the database state should be like in this arrange part of the integration test.
Mhm.
And yeah, we're actually like in the process of like yeah, talking to a bunch of users who are already using it, and also finding like companies who want to increase their test coverage, or who have problems with their testing and want to improve that, and kind of working closely with them to make that happen. Yeah, and yeah, that's kind of a huge focus for us as we figure out like how do we want to monetize Colo? Like so far, Colo has just been kind of supported by Simple Poll as a side project, but we're kind of making it real, making it its own business. So as yeah, and we think the test generation is going to play a big part in that.
Right. Like that could be certainly a premium team feature sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Enterprise. Version comes with auto testing.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, if there's anyone listening and like they're keen to increase their code coverage, please email me. Maybe we can leave my email in the notes or something like that.
Yeah, I'll put your contact info in the show notes for sure.
It's yeah, it's actually really nice. It's just w@colo.app.
Oh, very nice.
So yeah, if anyone's listening and wants to kind of like increase their code coverage, or has a lot of code bases that have 0 coverage that would benefit from getting to like some level of coverage, we'd love to help you and talk to you. Even if the solution doesn't like involve using Colo, just really keen to talk to anyone about like Python tests and what can be done there. So yeah, please hit me up.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely put some details in the show notes for that. All right, so I have some questions as well.
Please, yes.
Right here, I'm looking at the web page, and the angle bracket title is Colo for Django, but in the playground thing you sent me, it was on plain Python code. It was on algorithms. It was on pandas, which I thought was pretty interesting how much you could see inside pandas. Makes
Yep.
me wonder, if you look at the web frameworks, there's 2 or 3 more that are pretty
Yep.
popular out there, and they all support middleware.
Yeah, 100%. So, uh, Colo kind of started as like this like side project for our Django app, and I
Right?
think that's why we kind of went there first. It's kind of the audience we know best.
You could dog
Lily,
food it
who
as well, yeah.
exactly dog fooded. Lily, who's an engineer on the team, is and who's been building kind of a lot of a lot of the Python side of Colo
Mhm.
is like a core contributor to Django. So Django is like really where we're home. And to be honest, I think when building a new product, it's kind of nice to keep the audience somewhat small initially, keep like building for very specific needs as opposed to going like very wide very early. So that was kind of very much the intention. But there's no reason why Colo can't support Flask, Fast API, um, the scientific Python stack. Yeah, like as you can see in the playground, it does totally work on plain Python. It's really just a matter of like honestly, like fast API support would probably be like a 40 line config file
Yeah, exactly.
in like our code. And there's actually, we're thinking of ways to um, we're thinking of ways to just make that actually a bit more pluggable as well. There's only like so many things we can reasonably support well ourselves. But to get
Yep.
like even oh sorry, go on.
I was gonna say, if somebody else out there has an open source project, they want it to have
Yep.
good support for this, right? Like, "Hey,
Exactly.
I
Yep.
I run HTTPX, or I
Yep.
run Lightstar, or whatever, and I want mine to look good here too," right?
100. Yeah. No. Totally. So the thing you can do already today is there's a little bit of config you can pass in, and actually, if you look back on the pandas example, you'll see this. So by default, Colo actually doesn't show you library code if you use it in your own code base. But you can tell it, show me everything that happened, like literally everything, and then it will do that for you. So in this example you're looking at, or if anyone's looking at the playground, if you look at the pandas example, it'll say like include everything in pandas. And that'll give you like a lot more context. The thinking there is that most people don't really need like the issues you're going to be looking at will be in your own code or in your own company's code base. You don't really need to look at the abstractions, but you totally can. But yeah, to answer the question, like we have this like internal version of a plugin system where like anyone could add fast API support or like a great insight into PyTorch or what have you. The way it all works technically really is it's totally built on top of this Python API called set profile.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Have you come across this before? It's a bit similar to set trace actually.
Yeah, I think so. I think I've done it for some C profile things before. I'm not totally
Nice.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really neat API, to be honest, because Python calls back to your like the callback that you register on every function enter and exit. And then Curlo essentially looks at all of these functions, enters and exits, and decides which ones are interesting. So the matter of like supporting, say, fast API is basically just telling Curlo, these are the fast API functions that are interesting. This is the fast API function for like an HTTP request that was served. This is the HTTP response. Or similarly for SQL Alchemy, this is the function where the query was actually executed and sent to the database. This is the variable which has the query result. Like there's a little bit more to it. And I'm definitely like, generalizing, but it's kind of like in principle, it's as simple as that. It's like telling Colo, here's the bits of code in a given library that are interesting. Now just kind of like display that and make that available for the test generation.
Hmm. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, I totally agree with you that getting focused, it probably gets you some more full attention from the Django audience. And the Django audience is quite a large and
Right.
influential group in the Python web space. So that makes a ton of sense, especially since you're using it.
Yep.
By the way, it was Lily's Mastodon profile, I believe, that I ran across that I
Oh,
first
cool.
discovered Colo from.
That
So
would make sense. Yep.
of all the places, yeah, or a post from her or something like that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, cool. All right, so let's talk about a couple other things here.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So for people who haven't seen it yet, like you get quite a bit of information. So if you see like the GET request, you actually see the JSON response that was returned out of that request, and it integrates kind of into your editor directly, right? If you've seen CodeLens before, it's kind of like CodeLens, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. This
Okay.
is another thing which I think is pretty novel with Colo. Like I think it's reasonably common for existing debugging tools to show you like, oh yeah, this is the headers for the request, or this is like the response status code. But um, especially working with the Slack API in SimplePoll, you're constantly looking at payloads and what were the values for
Yeah.
things and what are you
Yeah, you
returning.
don't directly in production, you don't directly get to even make those or receive those requests, right? There's some like
Yeah,
system in Slack who was like chatting with your thing. You're like, well, what is happening here, right? Not that you would
exactly.
actually run this
No,
in there, but
I mean it's funny you mentioned this because there is one experiment we want to run of kind of actually enabling these extremely deep and detailed Colo traces in production.
hmm
We haven't explored this too much yet, and I think we're going to focus a little bit more on the test generation. But you could imagine like a user who's using, yeah, who's on the Talk Python site, and they've got some incredibly niche error that no one else is like encountering, and you've
yeah,
tried to reproduce it, but you can't reproduce it.
oh, that's interesting.
Maybe there's a little bit of information in like your logging system, but it's just not enough, and you keep adding more logging, and you keep adding more logging, and it's just not helping. um, like imagine a world where you can say just for that user, like enable Colo and enable like these really deep traces, and then you can see whenever the user next interacts, like the value for every single variable for every single code path that executed for that user. That's just like, yeah, I think one of
That's
one of our users described it as like a debugger on steroids.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty interesting. Sounds a little bit like what you get with Sentry and some of those things, but maybe also a little bit different. So, you
Yeah.
could do something like, here's a dear user with problem. Here's a URL. If you click this, it'll set a cookie in your browser, and then
Mm,
all subsequent behavior, it's on it. You know what I mean? It's like recording
right.
it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's
that'd
like
be
we
pretty
can
interesting.
fully debug your. Yeah, I think it makes sense in the case like if a user, it could even be an automated support thing, right? Like
Mm,
if a I think a couple of sites have this where you can like do like a debug dump before you submit your
mm,
support ticket. This is almost like that. And then as an engineer who's tasked with, digging into that user's bug, you don't have to start with like piecing together what was this variable at this time when they made that request 3 days ago. You can
mm.
just see it.
How about this? If an error ever encounters an exception on your site, you just set the cookie
Right.
that everything else they do is now just recorded until you turn it off on
My
them.
God, you're giving me so many good ideas.
That'd be
Wait, let
fun,
me
right?
start writing this stuff down.
Hey, let's record it. It'll be fine. Um,
That's awesome.
yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that's interesting. People can check it on the site. It's all good.
Yeah.
However, we talked a little bit about the production thing. Like another thing you could do for production, if this requires both a decent amount of traffic and maybe you could actually pull this off on just a single server, but you could do like, let's just run this for 1% of the traffic so that you don't
Right.
kill the system, but you get, if that's why I see you have enough traffic, is like
Yep.
statistically significant sampling of what people
Yep.
do without
Yep.
actually recording, a
Yeah.
million requests a day or something insane.
100%. I think there's
Yeah.
really something there. Or like, I mean, how cool would it be if yeah, honestly, there's I could go on about this whole idea of like runtime data and like improving
Mhm.
software understanding for days, because I just think like it's really this like missing layer, right? Like all of us constantly imagine like what is like we play computer looking at our code, imagining what the values can
Mhm.
be. But like, yeah, say you're looking at some complex function in production, and you want to understand how it works. Like, how useful would it be if you could see like the last 10 times it was called, like what were the values going into it and what were the values coming out of it? Like that would
Yeah,
be, I just think like, why do we not have this already? Like,
I know.
why does your editor not show you for every single function in the code base, like give examples of like how it's actually used like in production?
Yeah. Yeah, and then use those to generate unit tests. And if there's an error, use that to
Right.
generate the edge case, like the negative case, not the positive case, a unit test, right?
Exactly.
There you go.
Yep.
All right.
Exactly. It's all like
Well,
kind of hanging together. Like, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, once you have the data, you have interesting options.
Yep.
Yeah, so business model. This is not this I maybe should have started sooner with this, but this is not entirely open source. There may be a little bits and pieces of it, but in general, it's not open source.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I'm not putting that out there as a negative, right? This looks like a super powerful tool that people can use to write code in, and that's
No, for
fine.
sure. Like, yeah, I think the open source question is super interesting. Like, I think it's always been like something we've thought about or considered. I think there is, yeah, with developer tools, I think business models are always super interesting. And we want to make sure that we can have a business model for Colo and like run it as like a sustainable thing, as opposed to it just being like a simple Paul side project kind of indefinitely. Be great if Colo could like support itself and yeah, have a business model. I think that's how it can like really fulfill its potential in a way. Um, but that's not to say that like Colo won't ever be open source. Like I think there's a lot to be said for open sourcing it. I think especially like the capturing of the traces is maybe something like I could see us open sourcing. I think the open source community is fantastic. I do also think it's not like a thing you get for free, right? Like as soon as you say, "Hey, we're open source," you you open yourself up to contributions, right? And to like the community actually getting involved. And that's great, but it also takes time. And I think like that's a path I would like to go down when we're a little bit clearer on like what Colo actually is and like where it's valuable, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah,
So
sure.
like if it turns out that no one cares about like how to visualize code, then like that's a great like learning for us to have made. But I'd rather get there without like a lot of work in the middle that we could have kind of avoided, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah, for
um,
sure.
like it feels like once we have a better sense of the shape of Colo and what the business model actually looks like, then we can be a bit more, yeah, we can invest into open source a little bit more. But to be
Mhm.
honest, like based on how everything's looking right now, like I would not be surprised at all if like big chunks, if like Colo becomes open core or big chunks
Yeah.
of it are like open source. Yeah,
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
it is fully free at the moment, so that's worth calling out. Like
Yeah.
there's no cost or anything. You can also like, you download the Python package and guess what? You can look at all of the code. Like it actually
Yeah,
is all of theirs. It is all kind
sure.
of like visible.
Yeah, yeah. And I that kinda leads into the next question is, I've never used GitHub Copilot and a few of those other things
Mm,
because it's like, "Here, check this box to allow us to upload all of your code
right.
and maybe your access keys and everything else that's interesting so we can, 1, train our models, and 2, give you some answers." And that just always felt a little bit off to me.
Mm.
What's the story, with the data?
Yeah, great. I mean, so at the moment, Colo is like entirely like local product, right? So it's all local. Like you don't have to. Yeah, you can get like all of the visualization and everything just by using local Colo in VS Code. We do have a way to like upload traces um and share them like with a colleague. This is actually also something I think is like kind of playing with the idea of like writing a little like Colo manifesto. Like, what are the things that we believe in? One of them that I believe in, and this goes back to the whole like runtime layer on top of code, and like there's this whole dimension, this like third dimension to code that we're all simulating in our heads. I think like it should totally be possible to not just like link to a snippet of code like on GitHub, but it should be possible to have a like link, like a URL to a specific execution of code, like a specific function, and actually talk about that. It's kind of wild to me that we don't have this at the moment. Like you can't send a link to a colleague saying, "Hey, look at this execution. That looks a bit weird." Right?
Right, we ran this in continuous integration and it crashed, but I don't understand. Let's look at
Right.
the
You can
the
link to
whole
like
deal.
CI runs, you can link to like Sentry errors, but like
Mhm.
if you're just seeing something slightly weird locally, or like even something slightly like weird in production where there's no error yet, you can't really like link to that. Anyway, like this is kind of a roundabout way of me saying that like I think that totally should be a thing. Like you should be able to link like generically to like an execution of a function or an execution of a request, and like that would totally have to live somewhere, right? So this is where there's some idea of like Colo Cloud comes in, and this is where you could like connect your repository, and then Colo would like as part of that, just like GitHub does, have access to your code and like show you the code in like the Colo Cloud. So I think there's definitely like useful things that are possible there, but at the moment, it's a fully local experience. Like your code doesn't ever leave your system. You can, if you want to, like upload traces, and then Colo stores the like trace data, not the code, just the trace data. But yeah, very local experience right now.
Okay. Yeah, a little SQLite database.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, SQLite's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's incredible piece of software.
Yeah, it really, really is. All right, let's close out our conversation here with a little bit of a request from Michael. Right now, it's VS Code only. Any chance for some PyCharm in there?
Yeah, so this is our top request, like PyCharm support.
Yeah.
And we've decided, like super small team, like we want to kind of support everyone, but we've been working very heavily actually the past few months on a web-based version, which is, I'm happy to say, like very much nearing completion. And there's a few bits and pieces where like it's really nice to be integrated super deeply into the editor, like the code lenses and all of that. And I think there's a chance we'll have that for PyCharm eventually as well. But we actually found that like they're building out this web version, there's a few things that are actually much nicer when you have the full control over the UI in terms of like browsing around a trace, highlighting little bits of code. So for example, we in Colo, like a given function call, we call a frame, and you can look at a given frame both in VS Code but also in the web version and see the code and see all of the data that pass through the code. But something we can do in the web version we can't do in VS Code is actually show where the current function was called from and actually show like a preview of that code. In VS Code, you can't really show like,
you can layer multiple files together or different.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
You can layer. So we actually have like, there's actually a lot of like, I was surprised by how many different novel like kind of ways we had in the web that we just never even considered with like a direct editor integration in terms of displaying this runtime data. So like, long story short, like you want a PyCharm integration, let me give you something even better, a web version.
So would that work like you run a certain command or something when you run your web app, and then it just generates the SQLite file, and then you could just explore it with a web view? Or what are you?
Yeah, it's actually kind of cooler than that. So if you're using Django or in the future like other things with a typical middleware, you would just like go to localhost 8000.
Oh, I see. Just
Colo.
like kind of like you do for Open API docs.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And then the whole experience is just there. If you're not using a middleware, we'll have a command like colo serve or something like that.
Sure.
And that'll host the same experience for you.
Nice. Yeah. Just make sure it's off by default, or it only responds on localhost or something like that. Don't let people ship it on accident.
That would be bad news. No production use of this.
Yeah, I mean, people already know about the Django debug settings, but I guess you could sort of layer onto that, right? Probably.
Yeah, I think we actually do that at the moment, but it's awesome. worth remembering.
I know. I'm just thinking of like, oh, this is really cool to explore.
100%.
CNN.com is awesome. Look what it's doing.
Look at all these requests and all this.
Exactly.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and the API key is so interesting. Anyway, that's a bit of a side conversation. Let's just let's wrap it up with final call to action. People are interested. What do they do?
Yeah, go to colo.app and check it out. We have the playground link there, play.colo.app. Easiest way to kind of see what Colo is and what Colo does. But we'll say the most powerful way to actually see Colo in action is to use it on your own code base. So seeing the visualization and the test generation capabilities is just like, yeah, the most useful when you use it on your own code base. So hopefully the playground can entice that a little bit. And yeah, really the most important thing for us right now is, yeah, chatting to folks who want to increase their test coverage, want to like build automated testing as part of their workflow, and yeah, work very closely with you to make that happen. So if that's you, please email me at w@colo.app.
You need that pause for the W. That's right. Or the two ats. Awesome. Will, thanks for being on the show. Congrats on both of your projects. They look really neat.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so excited to have been on.
Yeah, you bet. Bye.